Okay. Hi, Shelly.
Hello.
It's really great to meet you.
Yes, yeah. Likewise.
Um, I it might be helpful for me to start by introducing myself, and then I'll ask you to do so. So I am Alma, and I'm having these conversations as part of my systemic family therapy masters, which I'm doing at the Tavistock. And I got to this topic, I think partly because of my own family history and interest in oppression and resistance linked to that, but also because I've been working for the last 10, 12 years in children's services in London, and feeling like some of the ways we're working aren't helping the families we work with. And then when I came across work by people like yourself, and some of your colleagues and others that seem to take a very different approach where resistance is centered, I felt excited and I felt inspired. And it seemed like it could be a more ethical way to live and practice. But I'm still sometimes struggling to make it happen or make it work in my actual clinical practice.
Okay.
So I thought, let me talk to some people who've made this their way of working. And maybe that will help me learn how to be in sessions with families, how to use these ideas in different ways. And hopefully it might be interesting or useful for others who also feel inspired, but maybe have moments where they think, oh, this is clumsy and clunky and it's not going how I wanted it to go or how I thought it might go, or isn't feeling like it's fitting right now.
Wow. Well, these are, I think, all of our favorite kinds of conversations. So, yeah, very happy to be invited in to talk about these things. Yeah.
So I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about you, and also how and when the concept of resistance first became important to you.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's always been important to me. I think it's been important to me long before I ever called it that. And that's likely true for all of us who are doing this work, which is why it landed in the way that it landed, probably similar for you. Yeah, so I grew up in Northern Canada, and I grew up in a largely Indigenous community, a wonderful place to grow up in so many ways. And I think I always understood about racism and oppression from what was happening around me and from my parents' understanding of it and their teachings. And it was always a topic. And just something I always felt really concerned about. I always remember feeling concerned about it. And I entered this work as a very young person, and I was already a mother, and I was a very young person, not completely clear what I was going to do with it or what I was doing in it. And I found myself in a group home. Fortunately, these places don't exist anymore. Or at least they don't exist in the form that they were then. But I was my first employment in this sector was in a group home for children between the ages of 6 and 12, and there were between 6 and 8 young people in this home, and they were being managed behavior management was the term of the day, and the way that they were being treated, to use the term very loosely. And I remember thinking, I was 23 years old and a mother, and I remember thinking, how does this make any sense at all? Even if it could help them, and I'm pretty sure it won't. They are just little tiny people, and they're going to go back to their families where presumably nothing has changed. And then what's going to happen? They're just going to be angrier than they already are, and they are very angry little people. It just didn't make any sense to me. And so that led me to a place that I am forever grateful for, and that is systemic family therapy. And because I just knew that I did not want to do that. I didn't want to understand children in the way that they were being understood there, in a highly individualistic behavior modification kind of way. And that began a journey that I feel I'm still on. And I just became fascinated with understanding problems as living in a system and as being interactional. And I feel like I feel very fortunate that I became a student of interaction almost right away in my career. And as a student of interaction, you start to pay attention to things like resistance. I feel I already, from an early age, was understanding things like racism and oppression and resistance, but I didn't have the language for it. And then as a student of systemic family systems, then you start to pay attention to, well, what does she do when he does that? And where are the children when that's all happening? And so anyway, I started to do that. And along that way, I became a foster parent. And then I started to know, because I was already a student of systemic family therapy, I was paying attention to patterns. And what are the patterns that seem to reoccur and reoccur and reoccur? And I was noticing that every single child that comes into my home has a mitt full of medications and a list of diagnoses as long as your arm. How does that make sense? Like, is every single child biologically flawed? Is that possible? So I was asking those kinds of questions, and that's when I met Alan, and he was an instructor in my master's course, for a trauma and violence course. And then, yeah, the rest of the pennies kind of dropped at that point, and all the language came into place for these questions that had been kind of swimming around. And I'd been poking at some things prior, but I didn't really know what questions I was even asking. I was just uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable even in my work as a systemic family therapist, as uncomfortable with what that way of understanding families and systems and interaction, what they did with violence when it came up. And now I understand it as highly mutualizing. And like systemic family therapy doesn't have a really good analysis of violence, really. And so anyway, that's kind of was where it went for me. And so when I met Alan there, I started talking to him about children and what children do when they resist violence. And specifically at that time, I was very interested in children from government care and the foster care system. And I still am, but it broadened out from there over the years to just all children. What do children do when they are experiencing violence? And then what do professionals do in turn when they are so-called treating children? And where are the misses in all of that, which are tremendous. And I think that's what you're talking about. So that's a bit of an introduction, and I think that's been my work for the last 15 years. And I do work directly with children and families in practice, and with all the systems that surround them.
Thank you so much for that, Shelley. And part of what I'm hearing you say is that from quite early on, you had a bit of a resistance to the sort of dominant practice or the stories that children are receiving either into your care personally or professionally, the stories that they came with, and saying, hang on a minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I could think of each one of them one by one by one. You get these phone calls saying, yeah, can you take this kid? Is it going to be safe enough for your kids? He's a sex offender. Or can you take this kid? She might die. All of her internal organs are compromised. She has bulimia. We will pay for all of your cupboards in your fridge and your freezers to be locked up. These are the kind of things that I was not 30 yet when I was doing that. And I remember just saying, well, yeah, we will take her. And I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know anything about bulimia, but I am not doing that. Thanks. And so these were the kinds of things that just kind of figuring it out as we go, knowing what we absolutely weren't going to do.
I mean, I had quite a visceral reaction when you said that thing about the locking the cupboards.
Yeah.
What is that communicating to a child that comes into your home?
Can you imagine?
Yeah. But I'm also amazed, you're saying you were 23, that you had that knowledge, that reaction, that sort of, hang on, this isn't okay. Where do you think that came from, that clarity that you had?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is it's just basic, isn't it? Like it's just basic humanity on one hand. And we talk about that quite a bit in our office. Isn't it astounding how just basic kindness is seen as extraordinary? And what does that say? Like just basic kindness and basic humanity and basic dignity is seen as so extraordinary. And so that's one thing. I don't think it's that extraordinary to bring, if you're signing up to care for a child, to say, well, okay, she's a child and I'm not going to lock everything up so that she can't get a glass of milk. Like, I don't know anything about bulimia, but I know that's not reasonable. And so that's one thing. And then another thing is I just credit my family. I credit my grandmothers, both of them. I credit my mother, who's incredibly kind. I credit my father, who is, for his time and now currently just an unbelievable feminist, and has a beautiful way of advocating for women. And I would never have described him that way growing up, but I always knew it. And so I feel I've just had all these gifts of from the people surrounding me that that kind of kindness really is just in was always it was always given to me. And so it's not a leap to nobody would ever walk into my grandmother's house and find locks on the cupboards. Not in a million years. And so I think we gain that from our ancestors, right? And yeah, so that's it. And I think it's basic.
Thanks. When you're thinking or working with resistance in practice, how do you talk about power and resistance?
Well, I don't like I listen.
Okay.
And then what I find is everybody talks about power and resistance. And if we're listening for it, then it comes into the conversation inevitably. And then it's available for us to talk about from the things that people say. The biggest mistakes I've made, and I have made them lots of times, is when I bring them into the conversation as topics that I think need to be talked about. And they're not up for conversation yet. It's too soon, or it's not right, or the way that I'm bringing them up don't land for people. But I think in sitting back and just listening for these things to come up for people in the natural way that they do come up for people, and then hearing it when they do and asking about it when they do, then it's natural. Then it's not a hard conversation. It's not a awkward conversation or an inappropriate, or it will just naturally flow, and the next natural thing happens. It's not like you're pushing. Are we there?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
The bit where it cut out was you were just saying it's the most natural thing.
Yeah, it's a natural thing. And so it's not our agenda to talk about the power imbalance in somebody else's relationship. It's up for them. And when it's up for them, they speak it.
I'd love you to say a bit more about that mistake, because that feels like a very familiar
Yeah.
of some of the, like, I've had conversations which have felt fantastic and different and, you know, like really moving for me to just be able to sit with someone telling me all the ways in which they've felt strong and powerful and capable. You know, and I'm feeling like that's not the way it's been framed before. But I certainly feel, you know, I had a familiar, like, yeah, I feel like I've been there where I've maybe tried to bring the conversation or tried to create something. How do you sense when the timing's right, and how do you listen? You know, you said it's more about the quality of your listening, something about how you listen that is making a difference there rather than what you say. So what is it about how you listen, and how are you then sensing there's something that, the timing's right for something else?
Well, yeah, it's such an interesting one. Like, I often think that if somebody were watching me or if it was videotaped or something.
I don't know if you're hearing me, Shelley, but you've gone again. I'm going to turn off my video and see if that helps in any way with the connection. Hi again.
Hi.
I've switched off my video because I thought maybe that will help with the connection.
Oh, sure.
Maybe you'll do the same. You're freezing anyway, so
Yeah, sure. Let me do that. There we go.
maybe that will
That-
help.
Yeah, so in those early sessions with people, I often think if somebody was watching or videotaping or something, that it would look like I'm not doing anything at all. I'm not talking very much. I'm like sometimes more than others, but yeah, I'm just really listening um for their version of what's going on, and and the language that they're using. And so I'm listening for their really clear descriptions, and how they're describing specific events. And so if they're using mutualizing language to describe violence, um, I might just ask about that. And so if they say, well, I just really wish there was less fighting in my marriage. I'm worried about the kids. I might just say, well, can you talk about the fighting? Like, who's fighting with who? What does it look like? Like, just trying to ask the more detailed questions, the more specific questions, um, to get down to who's doing what to whom.
Yeah.
And in doing that, what you're also doing is letting that person know that you actually understand something about this. So even in asking that question, well, can you tell me something about the fighting? Who's doing what to whom? Um, that question is quite alarming to people. They're not used to being asked any kind of detailed question about it. And I can think of one woman who came in and said, I need anger management. I am losing my temper way too much. I'm really worried. And recently I gave my husband a black eye. And that's not like me. I've never hit anybody in my life. And I don't want to be that person. And I said, well, would you mind if I asked you a bit about the black eye? And she said, no, I want to talk about it. And I said, okay, well, what happened leading up to that? Can you describe what happened? And so she started telling me about being camping with her husband and some friends, and they were sitting around a campfire, and they were having fun, and they were having some drinks, and everybody was happy. And then her husband started kind of giving her a bit of a hard time, like teasing her, and it was still kind of funny, and everybody was laughing. And then it went a bit far, and it felt embarrassing to her, and she kind of nudged him and asked him to stop. And instead of stopping, he went even further, and it started like name calling of her and really embarrassing her. And she didn't say anything. She just got up and went inside the trailer. And about 15 minutes later, he followed her in there, and she was crying. And he started making fun of her for being a baby and crying and couldn't take a joke. And that made her cry even harder. And then he just really laid into her and called her a wimp and a baby, and accused her of ruining the night. And she tried to get away from him by going into the end of the trailer where the bedroom is, and he followed her and gave her a shove and knocked her on the bed. And she tried to roll away from him, but he kind of jumped on top of her and started hitting her. And she covered her face, and he grabbed her arms and moved her arms to her side. And then he grabbed her by the neck and started strangling her and cut off her airway, and she couldn't breathe. And she was worried in that moment that she was going to die. She thought, this is it. He's going to kill me. And with whatever strength she had, she just pulled her arm back and plowed him in the face. And that caused him to release his hold on her neck. And he went to the bathroom and just started splashing water on his face, and she ran out of the trailer to her friend's trailer. And so as she's talking, I didn't say a word. She just told me the whole story. And so then at the end I said, so if I understand what you're saying, if there had been no strangulation, there would be no black eye. Is that right? And she said, no. And I said, that is not an anger management problem. That's a violence issue. And it's not your violence, it's his. And so just listening for the events and the sequence of events and how it's being described, but waiting. And so this was probably, I don't know, like 45 minutes into her description. And I didn't argue with her in the beginning, and I might have like early on. So when I talk about a mistake, I've had those sessions where I might say, oh, well, are you sure it's your anger management problem or something like that? And so just holding back from arguing with people until you have a full description of what it is that's going on. And even then, being really slow to introduce an alternative way of understanding things until it's so clear. I mean, in that case, it was just so clear that her punch was done in order to create a release of a strangulation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really makes sense. I've written in my notebook actions in their context.
Yeah.
Can really
but you have to have the full context before you can introduce an alternative story or introduce it as a form of resistance. And even then, I wouldn't use the language of resistance in my conversation with her, because that's how we describe it. That's the language we use to describe it. It's not necessarily a word that's going to make sense to her.
That story you said, that was 45 minutes into her telling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things I sometimes find in practice is I don't get a 45-minute tale. I get a much briefer version.
Yeah, that also happens. Yeah.
And so then how do you elicit that level of detail?
Well, if you get a much briefer version, then you ask for another example. And then another example, and then another example. And so sometimes you have 4 or 5 or 6 examples. And that's where this is where systemic family therapy is helpful, because now you have enough of a pattern where you can say, is it possible? I don't know, I'm listening to you describe your relationship with your husband, and it sounds a bit like, through the examples that you're giving, like he has worked pretty diligently to isolate you, to ensure that your relationships with your family are destroyed, to make sure that you don't have access to any money, to destroy your relationships with your coworkers, to minimize your influence over your own children, and to do everything possible to erode your self-esteem. Is this what you thought it would be like to be married to this man? Is this what you were hoping for? Is this what you feel a loving relationship is? You know, you could just start to ask questions like that. But you're listening to all these examples and then you summarize it all in a kind of statement like that.
And it's those statements then that are the tentative offering of a new
Yeah.
frame, a different.
Yes. Yeah.
And those are informed by.
Well, these are all, you know, you're listening for the perpetrator actions, right? Like in our framework, there's clear perpetrator actions. So she's not describing them necessarily like that, but that's what you're listening for. You're like, and so you just are pulling them out of her different stories of what's happened, and so what you can describe back to her is, well, he has isolated you by moving you 20 minutes out of town and up in the hills where you don't have a vehicle. He's separated you from your family. He's ensured that you don't have employment and therefore you don't have your own source of income. He's minimizing you in front of your children all the time, right? Like you just pull these clear acts that he's doing out of the stories that she's telling. And then you can also add in all the ways that you're hearing her resist that.
Would you have a kind of preference on which you start with? Like, would you more often start by highlighting the perpetrator actions and then come to the resistance, or it's varied?
It's varied. I think it really depends on what she tells you, and where she's at. You know, sometimes, yeah, sometimes some women are not describing this as a relationship where there's violence, and they're more saying, like that woman I'm telling you about, who's saying, I have an anger management problem and I need to fix it so that my husband's not at risk from me.
Yeah.
And then other times they be saying, I'm really scared, I am living with a dangerous man, I don't know what to do. So I think it depends where she's at and how she's describing them.
I'm thinking about some work I did recently where the sort of violence we were talking about was much more diffuse in that it was coming from lots of people, and it was more around racialized violence.
Right.
Just one perpetrator. So that, you know, so the various stories of violence, harm, aggression, oppression came from so many sources.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that's something, and that was one of those situations where I felt a bit in the way that I handled the conversation like I went too quickly.
Okay.
You know, there was, because each of the examples she was so brief with, I think I didn't in looking at the patterns, perhaps. But has that been a part of your work, or the way you've had these conversations as well?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah, and I always find it helpful to understand like what people have learned from their families, from their parents, from their grandparents, and they have their own knowledge of resistance, but they also have knowledge from history. And what have they learned about resisting racialized violence from their families?
You said you grew up in Indigenous communities. I'm wondering if that's to what you're saying now.
Yeah, like we have so much knowledge beyond just what we have experienced, and some of that's incredibly helpful. Well, it's all helpful, but yeah, including what we don't want to repeat, right? So I just think there's lots of conversation to have around that, and to be able to ask this person, because she's I don't know the gender, but yeah, to somebody who's experiencing racialized violence from multiple sources, which is most often the case. Yeah, to enter into that conversation, it's not this is not an individualized kind of issue. It's a social issue, and to speak about it as such.
I think for me, part of where, reading your work, Alan's work, and others, and the way I was trying to use it in those conversations, clumsily, but trying, was that I recognize, even for myself, looking at, my family's testimonies from Holocaust experiences, that
Yeah.
seeing the ways in which they kept a sense of themselves, practiced their religion, built community, even in that dire, horrific situation, that's when I see their strength and humanity.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of wanting to find a way to help others also see that in themselves when they're in these dire situations where the world is treating them abysmally.
Yeah.
To see what they've been doing to survive and to connect to their sense of themselves as fully human.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking back to what you said about the listening first, not introducing those ideas too readily, letting.
Yeah, that's right. And I think just switching that to a question, rather than something that you're searching for in people. And so, yeah, asking them just asking people what they do in those moments when when they are experiencing attack. What do they do? What runs through their mind? What do they say? What do they wish they could say? Those kinds of questions, without assumption, without the assumption that they're being guided by something, anything at all. Because we don't know. We do know that there's resistance happening, because we just believe that to be true, but we don't know what it is. And so to just be able to ask all those kinds of questions and be really open to all possibilities.
I'm listening to us talk, and it's also something I noticed in a lot of the writing, that the examples both of us are bringing are mostly conversations with an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if the conversations are the same or different, or how are they different in family work?
Oh, I love family work. It's always been kind of my favorite. Um, I think because there's so much going on, and family work brings about change in a much quicker way, I find, because there's so much information available. And um, so, um, how are the conversations different? Well, there's similarities and differences. When families have been through something terrible together, uh, we have a belief that they should be in conversation about that together. And our current mental health systems, at least in Canada, separate children from their parents in the helping profession. And so the children's programs are in one building and the women's programs are in another place, or the adult services are in another place. And there are very few family programs. It's very hard to get in, and if it's private, it's very expensive. So the opportunity to sit together as a family when you've been through something terrible together are very few. And the benefit of doing that is tremendous, because what happens is um, all of the information that is available gets to be heard by each other, things that they wouldn't ever have any way of knowing. Um, so the ways in which people respond and resist violence are largely unknown and unseen. And the ways that children act to protect their mothers, or the things that they wish they could do to protect their siblings or their mothers. Nobody's ever going to know that unless there's an opportunity to speak about it together. And if there's an opportunity to speak about it together, all kinds of amazing things happen. So it's our belief that every opportunity should be taken for that to happen when you can, and when families have been through something incredibly frightening. And it's actually not helpful at all in those circumstances to take the children and put them in a room by themselves with a stranger to talk about the scary thing that daddy did, and where their mom doesn't get to be a part of that conversation. Because what we also know is that violence harms the bond between mothers and children. And then professionals further that harm by taking those children and working with them on their own, which actually reinforces the message that mom isn't able to help them right now. And that's actually not true. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's our approach, is to work with families together wherever possible, and in all kinds of cases, because we work with perpetrators as well, down the road, there's an opportunity to involve the men who have done the harm.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that sort of
Mm-hmm.
when you're working with a whole family. And I mean, some of the work I've done has absolutely been including male violence to women, but also parental violence to children.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm not sure how to make use of this ethic of resistance or listening for resistance when you're working with perpetrator and victim together.
Well, that's not something that would be done unless it's really far down the road and safety's been established. So, how we do it, we do work with perpetrators and we work with victims who are the same family, but we're not working with them together until safety is definitely established. So in that way, we're working with the whole family, but our work with perpetrators is how we do that is that in our consent form with them, they agree to partner checks. So they know that in our work with them, we will be consulting with their partners or their former partners, whatever the case may be, along the way, so that we're not relying entirely on what they say. We need to be able to confirm with a significant person in their life around their safety. There's just been too many examples of that person saying that now that they're in counseling and they've gone to jail, they've done their time, they've paid their price, they've seen the light and everything. They're a new person now. That everything's safe, but that is actually not the case, and they're more dangerous than ever. So there's just no way we would do that work without doing partner checks.
Yeah, I mean that would be the same here. But I'm
Yeah.
also thinking about some of the sort of lower level concerns, right? You have a parent that maybe speaks in a way that's humiliating for the child, but isn't, we're not, the child is in their care, we're doing work with them, that sort of, you can see that there's something happening here that isn't okay. And you're trying to support this family, and you can see the child resisting. You can see the child and some of that behavior that might have been called defiant or challenging behavior from the child. When you see it in the context, you can see how they're protecting themselves from their parents' abuse. But it's emotional abuse, and it's not necessarily at a severity that we're separating them. And I can feel for myself that recognizing the child's behavior as in some way self-protective and resistance helps me not to pathologize that child and to see their behavior in its context. And I guess my question is, what do I do with that? What next? What happens in the room with that parent and child?
And it's so hard because every situation is unique, and so what you might do in one situation isn't necessarily what you would do in another. But just generally speaking, it's what's happening right in front of you is available to be part of your conversation, and to overlook it because it's awkward or because you're not quite sure, which is often the case, is a social response. Like we would understand that as a social response to a very specific kind of behavior. And so I think it's just important to acknowledge it as that, and probably just to reflect on it or get supervision around it afterwards. And that might be the decision that you make. It might be the choice that you make, and it's not a good or a bad one, um, depending on the individual circumstances of that family. But it could be colluding with a very specific kind of violence, as you're saying, emotional violence against a child or emotional violence in an intimate relationship. So being very, very cautious around that. And in systemic family therapy, it's called process interruption. When you say, hang on, I want to stop for a minute and talk about what just happened here. And so you're just stopping the, whatever it is that's going on in the session, and acknowledging the belittling or the interaction that just occurred, and asking about it and saying, I just want to ask you about what you just said there. And is this typical? Is this something that happens a lot? And how long has it been that you felt it was okay to talk to him like that? And what do you think it's like for him? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's when you say it, it's so obvious, but actually to think of my response as part of the social response.
Your response is definitely a social response. Yeah.
That's a part of what that child and family then, learn. Nobody's going to notice this or see this, or if I don't say anything, what that communicates.
Yeah. You're going to be a social response either way. Yeah. You're going to be a social response if you say something as a process interruption and say, okay, we're going to pause here and we're going to talk about what just happened. And if you choose not to, that's also a social response. So just understanding it as that, and then making a decision about, well, what was it in you that had you not responding, or that had you responding?
Yeah. And in that noticing and that process interruption, what we've talked about is, again, sort of noticing the belittling or noticing the violence. Would you also notice, and I appreciate that you're going to say it depends on the situation, but I'd love to know, how it depends on how you make that choice. Notice the child's responses.
Yes. I think that's the most valuable thing. And and we also think always about, how do you uphold the dignity of all people in these sessions, in these interactions with us. And that's one of the ways, I think, that you can do that. And by saying, actually, can we just pause here for a second? I noticed what just happened there. And I noticed that, when you just referred to your son as a dumb son of a bitch, his chin quivered, and I can see he's trying not to cry. And you could just pause there and leave some space. But what that's doing is that child is seen on a really emotional level, and you're standing with them, and you're not condemning anybody, or you're not cornering anybody. You're just saying, hey, wait, we're just not going to let that go. I think this is something we should talk about here. So you're not even saying, what about that should we talk about?
Mm. It's an invitation.
Mm-hmm.
You said you've had particular interest in children in state care.
Yes.
The shared interest of mine and the majority of my work at the moment.
Oh.
And I'm curious how the state's involvement in these children and families' lives, how that's changed your work with them, if it does. What's different about using these approaches in families where the state have gotten involved somehow?
Okay. Well, what's different for me is in my assumptions. So when the state's been involved in the lives of anybody, in the lives of children or parents, I am making an assumption that there's been harm or oppression, and that might not be the case, but I have I definitely have a radar going, and I just ask more questions. And when kids have been in government care or adults grew up in government care, I make assumptions around their experiences of grief, and I also make assumptions that that's largely unacknowledged. And again, I might not be right about that, so I'm not attached to it. It's just informing in the background of um, my, when I'm hearing what's going on for them and where my questions might lead me. So at least in Canada, and I've really looked at different research from around the world. I don't think it's any different in Europe and in different places in the world. There's just a lack of acknowledgement of what happens to kids as they move through the system of government care. And there's flippancy to the transient way that so-called care is provided, and the expectation of kids being grateful for what is provided, with absolutely no recognition of all of the losses that they're experiencing.
Yeah. It's bringing to mind a discussion we had in one of my meetings about a child who'd had 16 different placements.
Mm.
And, the idea that anyone who'd been moved 16 times
Wow.
would not be angry,
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Stunning.
And then what that child's responses are perceived as or understood as feels very limited a lot of the time.
It's such common sense to me that I can't believe this is still even happening. And to me, it's child abuse.
Yeah.
You like to assess and diagnose and medicate these kids for the failings of the system is child abuse. I mean, for so many of these kids, they don't ever recover from the pharmaceutical treatment that is done to them, and it's just so tragic.
Yeah. I have a hunch that if I ask you about more of your mistakes,
Yeah, go for it.
I might, because I found that really helpful. It's also reassuring. I'm
Good.
in an earlier stage of trying to become a family therapist, and so it's always reassuring when experienced practitioners share that it doesn't always go well for them either. But I wonder what you've seen as sort of, and I know you also do some training in this area. So what you've seen as some of the common pitfalls, mistakes, misapplications you see enthusiastic practitioners make. Or that you've made.
Yeah, it's easier for me to think about myself. Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing is too much too fast, and not finding the rhythm of the person that I'm talking to, going with my own agenda. And that it takes a lot. It takes a long time to feel confident enough that you can just relax and listen. And I think that that need to say something smart comes from a lack of confidence in what we're doing, because the stakes are very high for people. And so there's that, and I've just heard tons of people speak to this who are in supervision or in different training, and they do feel a lot of pressure to help people and to come up with something that is, golden. And so while people are talking, you're busy thinking about how to respond, how to come up with that smart thing. And that's not helpful because it's distracting. And I remember probably the most helpful session I ever had was with somehow this happened where a very elderly gentleman got a session with me. I was working at it doesn't matter. I was working at a different place, and I didn't have any control over who came. And I think he was in his late 80s, and he came in alone, and he had pretty severe hearing loss. And I don't talk that loud. I don't have a strong voice. So every time I spoke, he couldn't hear me, and it was annoying for him. And I had to purposely try and project my voice. And he started talking about his strata and the problems that he's having with his strata board and his housing. And he didn't understand how to fix it. He didn't know what to do. And he went into a very, very lengthy conversation about it. And in that, somewhere, he told me that his wife had died. But I barely caught it. I barely caught the details of that because I was busy thinking resentfully, how did this guy get in here? Like, I don't do this. I don't specialize in elderly care at all. I don't know what to do here. And I definitely don't know anything about stratas. And I think he needs somebody who works with elderly people with hearing impaired and knows way more about housing Like I have no idea about any of these issues. That's what was going through my mind for quite a long time, like probably 10 or 15 minutes. And it's embarrassing actually to think about it. Um, and then fortunately, at some point, I I snapped out of it, and I realized that I needed to look in his eyes. And I leaned forward and looked in his eyes. And at that moment, I just got it. Like I just got it completely. And I just said, "When did your wife die?" And he teared up and he said, "2 months ago." And I said, "Did she handle everything with your strata board?" And he started to sob uncontrollably, to the point where my eyes teared up. And like that happens, but it doesn't happen super regularly. And I went from like 15 minutes of being in la la land thinking, I do not do this. How did this guy get here? Why is he in my room? I suck at this, to like 2 minutes later, we were sitting there almost holding hands, crying. And that's it. Like, I think it's just about this is humanity, right? It doesn't matter how old he is, and it doesn't matter that he's talking about a strata board. He was actually just in such profound grief over the loss of his wife, and he didn't know how to manage things. And that's what he was there to talk about. And I can talk about that all day long. Like, that's what we do.
You can't see me, but my eyes were also tearing up just hearing that.
Oh, I still get teary when I think of him, because he was one of my greatest lessons. And about get out of your own way and just look at him. Why didn't I do that? Because I was just caught up in, we are also human. We get caught up in whatever we're caught up in. And I'm so glad. I don't know what it was, that some voice, maybe it was my grandmother, saying, just look in his eyes.
Yeah. Oof, important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, whether it's a 90-year-old man or a 7-year-old girl, or uh, whoever in between, that we think, I don't know how to do this. I don't know what to do. Well, you probably do.
Yeah. When I'm hearing you, I'm thinking also theoretically, like what am I hearing? What am I hearing Shelley do? What does that connect to? Because we can't help but map things onto what we already have some familiarity with or connection to. And I'm thinking about some dialogical practice, or the not knowing position.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's part of your theoretical influence, or if you see yourself doing something different to that.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I need to think about this for a second, because Alan and I had a great conversation about it, but I have to remember what that was. It was really cool. I think it was around, it was, I've always loved the not knowing idea. The conversation Alan and I had, it wasn't that long ago, because I was reading something about it, and I think I have to find that email, and I'll try and find it and send it to you. But we were challenging it a little bit because it was definitely about taking the not knowing position and the theory around that. And I think I sent him an email and said, "Hey, this is wrong though, because when I don't know, I really don't know. I'm not taking a position. Like, this isn't a position I'm taking. This is actually not knowing. So what's wrong with the language here? Like, how would we speak about this? It's almost like it was worded. I need to find what I was reading, because it was almost like it was a manipulation. Does that make sense?
So much, and it's interesting actually. I did a pilot interview with a supervisor of mine, who is a retired family therapist, and he's wonderful. He's called Chris, and he said something so similar. He's like, "You don't need to take a position. You don't know. Just don't know." And he described it as, I think the word he used was possibly patronizing, but that might be my memory adding that word. I'll have to go back and what he said. But you know, that there's something, if you're taking a position, then you think you do know.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly was our conversation. That's wonderful. So what about if you're just comfortable with not knowing? And what kind of confidence does it take to not know?
Yeah.
And to be very okay with that. I will tell you another story, because it's also very, it's been very influential in my work. I met a woman, this was quite a long time ago, who had been a client of a counselor who I supervised, and also a wonderful woman. And then quite abruptly, she stopped seeing that counselor, and she asked if she could see me. She didn't know me, but she knew my name, because when her counselor was away, I would cover for her. So she always kind of had my name as a backup. And anyway, she asked if she could see me, and I agreed, because she was there. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There was some serious stuff going on. And so in my first meeting with her, I asked her about that and said, okay, you had been seeing Marilyn, and now you're here, and that's fine. Do you mind if I ask you why? And she said, no, I don't mind. I really liked Marilyn. She was really nice, and I liked her. But to be honest, she doesn't have the kind of self-esteem that I need. I'm not well enough to see somebody like her. So I'm hoping that you have strong enough self-esteem to see someone like me. And I found that quite astounding. And so I said, oh, do you mind if I ask, like, what it was that had you thinking she didn't have strong enough self-esteem? And she said, no, I don't mind. It was in the way she asked questions. She would ask me questions in such a way that she needed me to answer them, so that she would know she had asked a good question. And that's how she feels good as a counselor. That gives her confidence. And I know that just by the way that she holds her head when she asks, and she kind of looks at me with this expectancy in her eye, like for approval that she's just asked a good question. And so I like her. She's a nice woman, and I want her to feel good about herself and about her job. So I gave her the answer that she needed. And, but to be honest, that was a lot of work for me, and it did absolutely nothing for me. And I found it kind of exhausting. So I quit her. And I don't think I'm actually ever going to get better. And it's not my goal to get better. I just need a place to vent. So, do you have the kind of self esteem that I require to not get better?
What an amazing
Right?
And what a beautiful sort of paradoxical invitation to you. Like, are you
Totally.
okay with me not getting better?
Right. Yeah. And I actually had to say, I don't know. I've never been asked that before. I've never thought about it before. And I don't know. But I do trust that you will tell me, because your ability to observe is astronomical.
Yeah.
And my invitation to you is to tell me. I need that kind of feedback. And so I'm agreeable to enter this relationship with you if you're agreeable to give me that level of feedback. And so off we went.
Yeah.
And we stuck together for a number of years, like not super regularly, but yeah, for a long time. Yeah. So there you go. Super interesting. And I love that, because we actually don't know what people are paying attention to about us.
Yeah.
We're paying attention to all these things in them, and they're equally observant about us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I were to sort of summarize what I'm hearing or thinking so far, and maybe I'll say it more about a future. I'm imagining in my next session that I'm going to have a sort of little Shelly on my shoulder.
Oh, that's
That the voice or the encouragement will be to slow down,
yeah.
to listen, to create space, to hold back from offering an explanation, but to punctuate what I'm hearing. And that's, you didn't use that word, that's kind of my interpretation of what you've said, is that to punctuate it, to notice, to say, you know, I say this, this, and this. Is that what you want from your life, or is that what you expected, or is that, you know, this is what I mean? Or not say, not even ask, perhaps just offer that noticing and find their rhythm.
Yeah.
And to be patient,
Lovely.
that it might take time.
Yeah. And to trust yourself. You know more than you think you do.
Yeah. I feel like we've journeyed a bit from resistance, and I wonder if it feels like that to you as well, or if to you the connection is obvious.
Well, I think resistance is not this finite thing. Like it's in everything. And through these different ways of being in relationship with people, it becomes just so obvious. And it shows up in so many different types of ways. I don't see resistance as a topic so much.
Right, as a what?
Pardon?
What did you say? You don't see it as
As a topic, like as a heading. I see it as something that's floating all around all kinds of things. And so to be available to see it, it requires, it's kind of like, well, just look in his eyes and you'll see it. But if you're busy in your own head, you won't.
And thinking about that woman who came to you, and what you did there is punctuate her kind of active role in constructing the support that she wanted.
Yeah.
Seeing her skills in noticing and in communicating, this is what I need now.
Yeah, and I mean, she would, and for a long time, she didn't describe herself as a person. I remember the moment when she accepted that she was a person. Up until then, she thought of herself as trash. It was a defining moment when she accepted that she was a person. And so to think of herself as somebody who resisted violence and resisted oppression and resisted somebody who was in a relationship with her in order to feel good in their own career, not to be completely available for her. She would never have thought of herself like that. That wouldn't have been something I could have presented to her initially, but I did think that. But she wasn't anywhere near able to think of herself like that initially, even though she laid it at my feet.
Yeah.
So I just held it, and months and months later, I was able to say, "Hey, remember that first time we met? Remember what you said to me? You were doing this kind of thing way back then, and I bet you were doing it when you were 6 years old." Like that's how sometimes the timing, it takes a long time. But I didn't say anything to her about resistance that first day, nothing.
Yeah.
Because she just didn't even think she was worth spitting on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the themes that I'm thinking about for when I come to try and sort of analyze these different conversations and bring them together, and I'd love your thoughts on it, is the sort of the direction in terms of macro to micro, micro to macro. Like how do the macro ideas that we have, or understanding that we have about power, resistance, and oppression, how do they play out in our clinical work? And I get the sense that it's different for different practitioners. What their beliefs are about power, politics, oppression, resistance, and also how they use them. And I'm getting a sense from you, and tell me if you think I'm seeing it right, that sort of understanding of power and oppression is in the background for you, but in the foreground is the micro interactions between people.
Probably. Like, I think that because so much of my work is in practice, but everything's informed by power and oppression. So that is so ingrained in our practice and our theory that everything's informed by it, in how I'm thinking about what's happening and the interaction between people, and the larger social systems that are at play. And so I don't know if they're in the background. I think they're a parallel. I would describe them as parallel. Whether or not I'm talking about it all the time with people, I don't like, I think I'm letting them lead those conversations more than I'm leading them. And that wouldn't be the same as probably Vicky. So we're different. Yeah. It's it'll be interesting to see your analysis of all of this.
Yeah. Well, I think part of what I'm searching for in this project is where do I position myself? Like how,
Yeah,
who am I
yeah.
in this work? What's going to fit? What works? What doesn't work for me?
Yes, and I had to do that along the way too, because I didn't develop response-based practice. I came into it later, and joined Alan and Kathy and Linda. It was probably 10 years old by at that time, and then I had to figure out my own way, and I'm not them. And so yeah, that's also what you and everybody else will have to do, right?
Yeah.
So, and I have to go because I have an 11 o'clock meeting, but I'm happy to talk again. I love it.
Oh, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes, it's super fun for all of us. So just let me know if you want to connect another time.
Yeah, I would love that.
And yeah, I wish you all the best with what you're doing. It's great. And please keep me up to date.
I will. I will. I'll probably send you some emails with some other questions or thoughts as we go, if that's all right with you.
Oh, sure. Anytime.
Amazing.
Okay.
Take
Thanks so much, Alma.
care. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.